August 30th, 1944. The civilians of Königsberg in East Prussia stumbled numbly through the smoking ruins of their city. The RAF bombed it in the night, destroying its historic castle and countless homes, and taking with them the lives of thousands of people. Those who hadn't been killed searched desperately for survivors. 200,000 people in the city were left homeless, including some 40,000 children. Caught up in a war they barely understood, watching as their homes and families were destroyed, the orphaned children of Germany joined the long list of Nazi victims. In East Prussia, which faced brutal Allied bombing and the full force of the Red Army's advance in 1945, these children were especially vulnerable. These children scattered into the countryside, most of them heading east towards Lithuania, where they would become known as the Wolf Children. Today, on A Day in History, we'll follow the story of these forgotten victims of the war, who still dealt with its consequences long after the fighting had stopped. Helmut Falk was only 5 years old when Königsberg was bombed. With the Red Army bearing down on them, survivors rushed to flee to the west. Falk's family was among them, piling on to the very last train heading to Saxony. The family waited in the station for 2 days, as the train swelled with refugees, and the conductors waited until the last possible moment to depart. Unfortunately for Helmut, he wandered off to play with his marbles in a quiet corner of the station when the train pulled away. His mother and siblings didn't notice he was gone until the train had already left. By the time Helmut stumbled out of his hiding place and asked the station staff where to go, it was too late. That had been the last train out of Königsberg. Helmut, like thousands of other children, was now alone. War made orphans of every nation, but East Prussia suffered especially badly. Few areas of Germany saw such complete devastation in the last months of the war. Allied bombing wrecked Königsberg in late 1944, and the Red Army arrived in January 1945 for a campaign that destroyed from the ground what the Western Allies hadn't destroyed from the air. By the time fighting stopped there in April 1945, the region was virtually a wasteland. The Nazis had spared no mercy for the Soviet civilians, and the Soviets repaid them in kind. Their advance into East Prussia was as brutal as everywhere else. Towns burned, women violated, and children held equally responsible for the crimes of their parents. The Soviet authorities would not help them, those children of the hated enemy. Whatever it took and wherever it led, the orphans of East Prussia, these wolf children, would have to fight for their survival alone. The most obvious direction to flee was west, away from the Soviets and back towards the German heartland. This was exactly what the family of 12-year-old Eva Briskorn did when the Soviets first entered East Prussia. Eva was the eldest of 6 children and worked hard to help her mother since her father had gone off to the war and never returned. In January 1945, Eva and her family loaded what they could carry onto a sled and left the city on foot just as the Red Army's assault began. Thousands joined them, clogging the roads with bodies and bikes. It was slow going, and they didn't make it far from the city before Soviet soldiers caught them and redirected them to a supposed refugee camp. The Soviets were not their protectors. They were indifferent to the fate of German civilians at best, and more often than not, the Soviets saw them as targets for vengeance. Eva learned of Soviet cruelty quickly. As they were marched down the side of a road by Soviet troops, one of their military trucks thundered past and ran over her youngest brother. The truck didn't even stop, and the Soviet soldiers escorting the marching refugees barely gave them time to pick up the body. They hastily bundled her 5-year-old brother's crushed corpse in blankets and placed it on their sled so they could keep moving. Starvation, exhaustion, and typhoid claimed all but one of her siblings in the following weeks. Her grieving mother was violated by the Soviet soldiers daily as they trudged through the countryside on their forced march. Eva, her mother, and her 10-year-old sister Gisela were all who remained from their 7-person family when they stopped in a village in West Prussia. By that point, the family were all infected with typhus and were too weak to keep moving. Eva's mother died in her sleep a few days later, leaving 12-year-old Eva to awaken to her mother's lifeless body lying in bed next to her. There were thousands of stories just like Eva's. Things were no better for those who'd gone east instead of west. For many, Lithuania was the closest and safest choice to escape. Fighting was over there, and there'd been plenty of contact and trade with them in years past. The trek eastwards was just as dangerous though. For those setting out in late 1944 and early 1945, they had to deal with the winter snows that froze people where they stood. The roads heading east were lined with the corpses of lone refugees, or those left behind by families who could not risk staying behind to bury them. By the summer of 1945, rural Lithuanians started to notice the large numbers of children appearing in the countryside. Sometimes they came alone, other times in packs. Some were bold enough to approach and beg for food, while others were only glimpsed through the trees before they scattered like frightened deer. They called them the WWII, meaning Little Germans, but their rough appearance and wild behavior also earned them the nickname of Wolfskinder, the wolf children. Living in the forest wasn't the worst survival strategy. The woods kept the children away from the authorities who might punish them, and they made for good camouflage to sneak up on farms and pilfer food, before vanishing back into the tree line. Sometimes, when multiple wolf children appeared in the same area, they formed a sort of gang or pack who would cooperate for survival in the woods. What sounded like the premise for a child's adventure novel was in fact a miserable reality for them. This included 9-year-old Anna Schneider. She'd been caught by Soviet forces with her brother and sister, but she managed to jump out of the cattle train used to deport her and scattered into the Lithuanian forest. There, she survived for months on her own by begging for food from the surrounding villages and sneaking into people's sheds to sleep at night before disappearing back into the woods the next morning. One might ask why the wolf children clung to the forests and farms when beggars like them would surely do better in the cities or by seeking government help. The reality was that it was much safer for them that way. Lithuania had endured Nazi occupation for 3.5 years, which meant that Germans weren't exactly popular with the locals. For many Lithuanians, the children were nothing more than pests and thieves. More than a few of the wolf children were shot at or had dogs set on them to scare them away. Many were caught and handed over to Soviet authorities. But these children had only ever known the Soviet Union as an enemy, who they were taught to hate. Red Army soldiers had destroyed many of their homes and killed their families. Cases like Eva Briskorn's, where she watched Soviet soldiers kill her brother and rape her mother in front of her, were plentiful. It is obvious why so few of the wolf children even considered seeking help from them. However, there were plenty of people who were sympathetic to these children. For every story of a child frightened away by an angry local, there was one who was given kindness. That kindness could be as simple as some bread and permission to sleep in the barn. There were some who went even further and took the wolf children in. The farms could always use more laborers after all, and it was just basic human decency to do what they could to help the children out. But this was more than most could manage. Not everyone had enough to spare to look after a child, no matter how much they might want to. There was also the question of punishment from the authorities. Under Soviet law, it was a crime to house unregistered German children. Being caught with one could earn the family and the child they were protecting serious punishment. Elfriede Müller learned this the hard way. She was only 11 when she was forced to flee her home with her mother and brother in 1945. A kind Lithuanian family agreed to take her in, but only her. Luckily, her mother and brother got a similar kindness from some other families nearby. They did not see each other often and lived in constant fear of the Soviet authorities, but they knew just being alive made them lucky. Their luck ran out in 1947. Elfriede's mother and brother, along with the family sheltering them, were taken away in the night by the Soviet police. Thankfully, the authorities were not aware of Elfriede, and no one came for her. But it was an open secret in the USSR that those who vanished rarely returned. People whispered about distant Siberia and its merciless labor camps, and all Elfriede could do was keep her head down and hope she wasn't sent there as well. The Wolf children couldn't go back home either. In 1947, Eva Briskorn tried to do exactly that. Her sister Gisela had been taken in by a family in a quiet German village who could not afford to feed them both, and who worried that two unregistered children would just attract too much attention. Eva had lingered around the village scraping flour dust off the grain mill to survive, before deciding her best option was to return to Königsberg. But upon completing the several hundred-mile trek on foot back to her home city, she found it unrecognizable. The Soviet occupation had swept away much of the city, and most of the residents were gone. Eva did not find a single person she recognized, but she did feel the hostile glare of the occupying Soviet soldiers, who made it clear she wasn't welcome in their newly conquered city. Eva spent only a few days in Königsberg before deciding to move on. Already, the trains were all in Russian, so all Eva could do was hop on one and hope it took her back to Germany. Hitchhiking orphans like Eva were common enough that the train staff made regular sweeps for them. Eva was discovered at a station down the line and kicked off, but she simply hopped aboard the next train, unaware that its destination was not Germany, but Lithuania. Eva didn't speak a word of Lithuanian when she found herself on a train platform in Vilnius. Having not eaten for days, she wandered around the market begging for one of the merchants to show pity. She was emaciated, and her clothes hung off her bone-thin body, which was enough to convince one woman to help her. The woman grabbed her by the hand and took her to a restaurant nearby, where she bought the girl some bread, butter, and tea. The simple meal was so much more than what Eva had had in so long that she broke down into tears. But years of trauma and fear had taken their toll. As soon as she'd wolfed down the meal, she waited for her benefactor to turn her back before bolting out of the building into the street. However, her body was overwhelmed by the first proper meal it had had in so long. She only got a few meters down the street before she fainted. Eva awoke in a hospital a short while later. She couldn't understand the Lithuanian doctors, and the only one who spoke German did so poorly. Fortunately for her, the doctors did not mind that she was German and allowed her to stay in the hospital until she was well again. Slowly, she learned Lithuanian and became fluent. It was a necessary lesson. German children were not supposed to be in Lithuania, and she would be deported if the authorities learned her true identity. Given her fragile health, the doctors believed that such an ordeal would be the death of her. It was a much better fate than what would have awaited her had she stayed back in Königsberg. In February 1948, the USSR expelled all Germans from the Königsberg region, now renamed to Kaliningrad, to clear the way for Russian settlers. It was one of several mass purges of ethnic Germans in Europe in the post-war years. Soviet authorities registered 4,700 German orphans still in the city in late 1947, all of whom were deported the following year. Combined with German orphans deported from Lithuania and elsewhere, some 30,000 children are believed to have been forced into new settlements in Soviet-controlled East Germany. They were packed into trains without enough food or water, and with no care for the diseases that such conditions would support. Hundreds of German children died in cattle cars during this resettlement. Thankfully, Eva was not among them. She remained in the hospital until 1949, when she was deemed well enough to be released. Having now learned Lithuanian, the 16-year-old could convincingly blend into the new country. She eventually found work as a maid and farmhand to an elderly couple, and at last found the safety she'd spent years searching for. Months rolled into years, and Eva, like so many other wolf children, integrated into her new Lithuanian life. This was the fate of most of the 45,000 wolf children who ended up in Lithuania. In time, they simply assimilated into Lithuanian society, burying their old identities and traumas while clinging to a new reality. But neither they nor their families could ever forget the past entirely. The Red Cross was one of the only groups who made any effort to help the wolf children in the long term. Despite numerous obstacles like false or non-existent records, anti-German sentiment, and the non-cooperation of Soviet authorities, the Red Cross began to reconnect some of the wolf children with their lost families as early as the 1950s. In 1957, Elfriede Müller, whose mother and brother had vanished so suddenly 10 years before, received an unexpected letter. It was from her mother. She had been sent to a Siberian labor camp and separated from Elfriede's brother, but was alive. In another stroke of good fortune, a few months later, Elfriede received another letter, this time from her brother. The enclosed photo shows a battered, overworked young man who looked 30 years older than he was. Time in the Gulag had that effect on people. But through the Red Cross, she at least knew he was alive. Elfriede's brother was not released from the Gulag until de-Stalinization in the late 1950s. Elfriede finally got to see him again, but his incarceration had wrecked his health. He developed tuberculosis, which killed him shortly after his release. Her mother had to wait even longer. It was not until 1990, after the collapse of the USSR, that Elfriede and her mother had the freedom to reunite, almost half a century after being separated. Eva Briskorn had also searched for her family. She'd married and had children of her own in Lithuania by 1965, when she received unexpected news from the Red Cross. Her father had not died in the war after all. He'd been taken as a prisoner by the Allies but had been released. Believing his wife and children were all dead, he'd settled in West Germany and remarried his wife's younger sister. Unfortunately, Soviet travel restrictions meant that Eva could not visit him, but she could write to him. She also learned that her little sister Gisela was alive and had found him too, and that many of her aunts and cousins had survived as well. Only with the cooling of Cold War tensions in the 1980s did many wolf children have the chance to return home. On a sunny day in a West German train station in 1980, Eva Briskorn stepped off the train onto her native soil for the first time in 35 years. Her father and sister were there to receive her. Now in her 40s, Eva would never be able to reclaim the years with them that she'd lost. But she could use the ones she had left. Eva reconnected with her family, reconciled with her sister, and got to know her father before his death in 1982. After the visit, she returned to Vilnius, where she had built her own life, but kept in contact through letters and further visits afterwards. It is telling that Eva's tale of watching her siblings and mother die, spending years in a hospital for malnourishment, and only seeing her family again after 35 years is considered one of the happier tales. She at least lived long enough to have a life and reunite with her loved ones. For the wolf children who starved to death in a Lithuanian forest or died in the pits of some Siberian gulag where the Soviets had thrown them, such happy endings were nowhere to be found. The story of the wolf children was barely known outside of Lithuania and Germany until the 1990s. Even now, awareness is low, and advocacy groups work hard to retrace family histories and arrange for support for the survivors who are now in their 80s or older. Even now, the life-changing effects of the Second World War linger on for those who were too young to bear any blame for them. For more on the forgotten victims of history and the people who victimized them, consider checking out more videos on our channel, A Day in History. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this one.